Hey there, and welcome to the Digital Lab with CSols, the podcast that cuts through the jargon and gets to the heart of what's really driving innovation in the lab. I'm your host, Megan Pettyjohn, and in this series, we're going to explore your options for digital technology in the lab. So, in today's episode, we're tackling the topic that's been on a lot of lab managers and IT professionals everywhere, their minds, and that is the move to the cloud. Specifically, we're going to talk about LIMS in the cloud. And to help us decode this, I'm thrilled to welcome a LIMS expert, Mike Piecuch, with experience spanning diverse LIMS across industries from mining to aerospace. Mike is no stranger to the cloud based solutions. Hi, Mike. It's great to have you on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad we were able to find some time between projects to connect on this.
Of course. So let's start with the big question. When we talk about LIMS in the cloud, what does that actually mean? Because to be honest, it could sound a bit buzzword heavy.
The cloud does get thrown around a lot, so that's a great place to start because it's not as simple as people might think. At its core, LIMS in the cloud means you're not hosting the LIMS software on a server in your own company or even allocating from a cloud hosting service such as Microsoft Azure or Amazon Web Services. Instead, the LIMS vendor manages and maintains the software and all the underlying infrastructure. This type of setup can also be referred to as software as a service or SaaS for short. Your lab can access the system over the internet, basically. So you're not responsible for the hardware, the operating system, database. You're just paying a subscription to use the service.
It's essentially a shift from owning the technology to renting the service. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Which gets me thinking, why would an organization want to make this move? Wouldn't that be a big change?
I think there's a lot of compelling reasons. The most common one is the upfront cost. An on premise LIMS requires a big initial investment in servers, licenses, and IT staff to manage it all. With a cloud based solution, you can often get started with a much lower initial investment and just pay a predictable monthly or annual fee. However, this may just move the overall cost to an ongoing operational expense instead of an initial capital expenditure.
Sounds like a cloud based solution might really be attractive to a startup or a growing lab.
Yeah, along those lines, another big driver is the reduced burden on internal IT, if you even have that many. The vendor handles maintenance, security patches, and upgrades. Frees up your in-house team to focus on critical projects. Cloud solutions can also offer greater flexibility and scalability, allowing labs to easily add more users or more storage as they grow.
Yeah, that sounds like a strong argument for any organization, especially those trying to manage costs and resources. But of course, it's never that simple, right? There's always some hidden complexities for those who are seriously considering this move. What are some of the key things they should know first? Like the things that might not be on the glossy brochure?
That's the most important part of the conversation. I think there are a few key areas where organizations need to be very thoughtful. I would say the first would be vendor lock in.
Ah, vendor lock-in, yeah. That's a term you hear a lot in software discussions, but how would that specifically apply to LIMS?
Well, with the LIMS, the issue is much bigger than just the software. It's about really your data. With an on premise system, you physically own and control your data from day one. You can back it up, archive, migrate it with relative autonomy. In the cloud, that's not always the case. The real and often overlooked issue is that there's no standardized way to export and import LIMS data. There's no universal file format. So if you decide to switch vendors down the road, you're at the mercy of your current provider's possibly proprietary data structure. They can make data migration, a custom and incredibly expensive project. It's a huge barrier to switching, and vendors know that.
So you're saying that a lack of industry standards basically, I don't want to say traps, but like locks in labs with their current vendor, which of course is a major incentive for the vendor.
Yeah, exactly. It wouldn't hurt for more open data standards in the industry as a whole. If we empower labs to choose the best solutions for their needs, not just the ones that they're locked into.
I mean, that sounds reasonable and logical, but that might not happen for a long time either. So until then, there are software vendors that can help with the data translation, right? Or companies like CSols to help with the data migration. Have you run across a situation where a client was locked in? I'm kind of curious if there was any effect on their day to day LIMS functionality.
Yeah, we've actually run across this situation when talking with a software as a service subscriber. What can happen is the functionality that you can access as an administrator of your limbs can be pared down so much that you may only be able to create users and change passwords. That's like the most basic of admin tasks. A common change within the lab could be adding or modifying analyses, updating COA reports, or creating new workflows. These type of updates would typically be handled internally by an admin, maybe even a super user in the lab. But a cloud-based system, that can mean that these simple tasks become a project, requiring you to request a change, maybe even pay for the actual updates, and wait for the changes to be made.
That sounds like it would be frustrating, especially for labs that make regular changes to keep up with technology. Okay, what's the next big consideration?
Data security. This is another area where cloud and on premise are fundamentally different. On premise, your data is within your own network. You have full control, and your IT team manages all the security protocols. In the cloud, you're relying on your vendor's security. Credible providers may have modern security measures, but it introduces a shared responsibility model. They secure the infrastructure, but you're still responsible for securing your own data and your own configurations.
So it's not as simple as just handing over all the security concerns to the vendor.
Yeah, and the unexplored issue here is the lack of transparency. How do you even really know how secure a vendor system is? It's hard to compare providers when you don't have access to standardized security reports or audits. This can make it more difficult for labs to demonstrate compliance with regulations like HIPAA or GXP.
Okay, let's talk about the more day to day operations. What are some of the implications of moving to the cloud on that front?
Yeah, big one is the loss of direct control over infrastructure. With on premise, your IT team decides when to do maintenance or updates. If a server goes down, they can physically go and fix it. Using cloud hosting solutions that you still control, like Azure or AWS, like I mentioned earlier, you can still spin up additional servers and adjust settings as needed. In the cloud, you're completely dependent on the vendor's service uptime. Something like a regional power outage at the data center could halt your lab operations. While you might have an SLA or service level agreement with them, it doesn't solve the immediate problem of lost time. The physical location of your data can also create legal, maybe even regulatory issues as it crosses international or state lines. This is something to keep in mind with new and upcoming industries like cannabis.
Yeah, and that's not something people often think about, that your data might be physically in another country.
Right. It brings up an issue of data ownership and segregation. Cloud providers may promise separation of your data, but the physical infrastructure is shared. For labs handling highly sensitive or proprietary data, this can be a major issue. The contract with them needs to be crystal clear on who owns the data and where it's located. With an on premise system, there's really no ambiguity.
Yeah, that's a critical point for negotiation. Let's move to one more consideration. What is it?
I'd say communications with other systems.
Okay. And how does the cloud affect a LIM's ability to talk to other systems in the lab?
So, on premise solutions, while they might require more effort to set up initially, can often be more deeply integrated with other systems in your local network, like your ERP or a CDS. With the cloud LIMS, the vendor promises to provide seamless integration, but the reality can be a fragmented ecosystem. The real challenge is the lack of standardized APIs and data structures. So, connecting a cloud LIMS to a cloud ELN or even a physical instrument often requires custom work. Actually, I'm working with a client right now where they're hosting their limbs in the cloud, but they have instruments on their internal company domain. This has caused delays in the instrument integrations and limited some of the automations that we had planned.
I can see that creating data silos. And those are definitely a pain point for many organizations that trying to fix that right now.
Yeah, they are. And they're a huge roadblock for modern labs that want to leverage advanced analytics or even AI. It's a big word right now.
Yeah.
If your data is trapped in separate systems, you can get a holistic view of your operations. There's a universal data standard called FAIR findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, that could be kind of a game changer. With that, every integration is a custom, or without that, every integration is a custom project, and you can unlock the full potential of a connected lab.
It's clear that while the cloud offers a lot of benefits, it's not a decision to be taken lightly. It requires a lot of strategic thinking, due diligence, and a clear understanding of your data. Mike, there's something we like to ask all of our guests when wrapping up an episode, and that is, can you share a final thought with our listeners that can help them achieve excellence in the selection of their LIMS hosting?
I would say the term cloud has become a catch all within pop culture to really mean anything you can access remotely. Many companies are moving towards hosted servers that are off site but are allocated to their company, and they're hosted by very large and well respected companies. I'm not a proponent of running a LIMS entirely in the cloud. When I say that, I'm meaning software as a service, due to the limited control it can offer over data and configurations. My experience is that an out of the box cloud LIMS solution almost always requires significant future configuration changes. Uh, you're renting a solution that this can complicate things down the line, and you might be tied to a specific vendor. You'll need to keep this all in mind when deciding if the advantages of a fully cloud based LIMS makes up for all the limitations you might encounter down the line.
That is fantastic advice. And a huge thank you to you, Mike, for joining us today and sharing this expertise.
Thanks for having me, Megan.
Of course, to our listeners or viewers, if you want to dive further into this topic, you can check out our August webinar. I can throw a link to it of the recording into the Spotify and YouTube descriptions. And with that, we'll wrap up this episode of Decoding the Digital Lab. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into LIMS hosting. For more information or discussions in the future around laboratory technology, please be sure to subscribe in Spotify or in YouTube, or you can sign up for our weekly industry newsletter. Cheers.